The iron chains scraped against the cold stone floor of St. Mercy's Chapel as 17-year-old Sarah Williams pulled desperately at her restraints. Her tear-stained face caught the dim light filtering through the stained glass windows, each sob echoing through the empty sanctuary like a prayer gone unanswered. Outside, thunder rolled across the Montana plains, but inside the chapel, a different kind of storm was brewing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Sarah didn't know was that Marcus Thornfield, the most feared rancher in 3 counties, was riding hard through the rain toward that very chapel. What he would discover there would shake the foundations of the small town of Cedar Falls forever. And what he would do next would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about justice, power, and the price of standing up for what's right. The morning had started like any other in Cedar Falls, Montana. Sarah Williams had woken before dawn in the cramped attic room she shared with her younger sister Emma at the Riverside Orphanage. The wooden floors creaked under her bare feet as she tiptoed around Emma's sleeping form, careful not to wake the 12-year-old who had finally found peace after another night of crying for their parents. It had been 8 months since the accident. 8 months since a drunk driver had torn their family apart on Highway 12, leaving Sarah and Emma with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. The state had placed them at Riverside Orphanage, run by the stern Mrs. Gladys Pemberton, a woman whose heart seemed as cold as the Montana winters. Sarah pulled on her worn denim jacket and headed downstairs to begin her morning chores. The orphanage operated on strict schedules and stricter rules. Every child had responsibilities, and Sarah's included tending to the vegetable garden, helping in the kitchen, and keeping the younger children in line. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was survival. As she stepped into the kitchen, she found Mrs. Pemberton waiting for her, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line. The woman's gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. "Sarah Williams," Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "We need to have a conversation." Sarah's stomach dropped. Conversations with Mrs. Pemberton rarely ended well for anyone. "Yes, ma'am?" "It's come to my attention that you've been asking questions around town. Questions about your parents' accident. Questions about the driver who killed them." Mrs. Pemberton stepped closer, her shadow falling across Sarah's face. "Questions that are disturbing the peace of good, God-fearing people." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had been asking questions, but only because something about the official story never sat right with her. The police report claimed the drunk driver had been traveling alone, but Sarah remembered seeing 2 figures in the car that night. She remembered the way the man in the passenger seat had looked right at her through the hospital window as she waited to learn if her parents would survive. "I have a right to know what happened to my family," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady with determination. Mrs. Pemberton's hand shot out and gripped Sarah's chin, forcing the girl to look directly into her cold gray eyes. "You have no rights here except the ones I give you. And right now those rights are being seriously reconsidered." The kitchen door swung open, and Father Benedict Morrison entered, his black robes rustling against the floor. The priest was a tall, thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He had arrived in Cedar Falls 6 months ago, shortly after the previous priest had mysteriously transferred to another parish. "Mrs. Pemberton," Father Morrison's voice was soft, but carried an authority that made even the stern woman release Sarah's chin. "Is the girl giving you trouble again?" The Williams girl continues to spread lies and disturb the community with her wild accusations, Mrs. Pemberton replied, stepping back but keeping her eyes fixed on Sarah. "Something must be done." Father Morrison studied Sarah with those penetrating eyes, and she felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the Montana cold. There was something wrong about this priest, something that made her skin crawl whenever he was near. "Perhaps," Father Morrison said slowly, "it's time. We helped Miss Williams find some spiritual guidance. Sometimes when young souls are troubled, they need to be reminded of their place in God's plan." Sarah didn't like the sound of that. She didn't like the way the two adults were looking at her, like she was a problem that needed to be solved, rather than a person who deserved answers. "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah said, backing toward the kitchen door. "I just want to know the truth about what happened to my parents." "The truth?" Father Morrison stepped closer, and Sarah caught a whiff of something sour on his breath. "Is that your parents are dead, and questioning God's will is a sin that requires correction." Before Sarah could react, Mrs. Pemberton had moved behind her, blocking her escape route. The woman's grip was surprisingly strong as she grabbed Sarah's wrists. "Take her to the chapel," Father Morrison instructed. "Perhaps some time in prayer and reflection will help her understand the error of her ways." Sarah struggled against Mrs. Pemberton's grip, but the older woman was stronger than she looked. "Let me go. You can't do this. I have rights." "In this town," Father Morrison's voice followed them as Mrs. Pemberton dragged Sarah toward the door. "I am the law, and God is the judge. And both have found you wanting." The journey to St. Mercy's Chapel took 20 minutes through the rain-soaked streets of Cedar Falls. Sarah's protests grew weaker as they walked, not from giving up, but from the growing realization that no one was coming to help her. The few townspeople they passed either looked away or nodded approvingly at Mrs. Pemberton, as if dragging a teenage girl through the streets in chains was perfectly normal. St. Mercy's Chapel sat on a hill overlooking the town, its Gothic spires reaching toward the gray sky like accusing fingers. The building was old, built by the town's founders over a century ago, and it carried the weight of that history in its dark stone walls and heavy wooden doors. Mrs. Pemberton produced a set of keys from her coat and unlocked the chapel's side entrance. The interior was dimly lit, with only the weak afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows to illuminate the wooden pews and stone altar. "This is where you'll stay until you come to your senses," Mrs. Pemberton said, producing the set of iron shackles from beneath one of the pews. "Father Morrison believes that solitude and prayer will help cleanse your soul of its rebellious nature." Sarah's eyes widened as she saw the chains. "You can't be serious. This is kidnapping. This is illegal." "Nothing is illegal when it's done in service of the Lord," Mrs. Pemberton replied, forcing Sarah to sit in the front pew before securing the shackles around her ankles. The chains were long enough to allow her to move around the immediate area, but not long enough to reach the doors. "Please," Sarah's voice cracked as the reality of her situation set in. "I just want to know what really happened to my parents." "Why is that so wrong?" Mrs. Pemberton paused in her work, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy flashed across her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Because some truths are too dangerous to be spoken," she said quietly. "And some people are too powerful to be questioned." With that cryptic statement, Mrs. Pemberton gathered her things and headed for the door. "Father Morrison will be by later to check on your progress. I suggest you use this time to pray for forgiveness and to reconsider your foolish pursuit of answers that will only bring you pain." The heavy wooden doors slammed shut, and Sarah heard the sound of multiple locks clicking into place. She was alone in the chapel, chained like a prisoner, with only her thoughts and the growing darkness for company. As the hours passed, Sarah's mind raced. She thought about Emma, who would wake up to find her sister gone with no explanation. She thought about her parents and the questions that had brought her to this point. Most of all, she thought about Mrs. Pemberton's words. Some people are too powerful to be questioned. Who was so powerful that asking about a car accident could land a 17-year-old girl in chains? What had her parents stumbled into that had cost them their lives and now threatened to destroy what was left of their family. The storm outside intensified as night fell, and Sarah huddled in the front pew, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The chapel grew colder with each passing hour, and her tears seemed to freeze on her cheeks before they could fall. She had nearly given up hope when she heard the sound of hoofbeats outside, growing closer through the storm. At first, she thought, it might be Father Morrison returning to check on her, but the rhythm was wrong. This was someone riding hard and fast, someone with purpose. The hoofbeats stopped outside the chapel, and Sarah heard heavy boots on the stone steps. A moment later, the side door exploded inward with a crash that echoed through the sanctuary like thunder. Silhouetted in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat and fury radiating from every line of his body, stood Marcus Thornfield. The ranchers. Eyes swept the chapel until they found Sarah, and what she saw in his gaze made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just anger, it was recognition. And something that looked almost like guilt. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed, his voice barely audible over the storm. What have they done to you? Sarah stared at this man she had never met, but whose reputation preceded him. Throughout Cedar Falls, Marcus Thornfield owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, employed half the men in town, and was known for his quick temper and quicker fists. He was also known for his fierce sense of justice and his unwillingness to back down from a fight, no matter who his opponent might be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But there was something else in his eyes as he looked at her, something that suggested. This wasn't the first time he had seen her face. "You're Sarah Williams," he said, and it wasn't a question. "How do you know my name?" Sarah's voice was hoarse from crying and shouting. Marcus stepped fully into the chapel, shaking the rain from his coat. His presence seemed to fill the space, making even the high-vaulted ceiling feel smaller. "Because I knew your parents. And because I've been looking for you for 8 months. Sarah's heart stopped. "You knew my parents?" Marcus knelt beside the pew and examined the chains around her ankles, his jaw tightening with each link he inspected. "I knew them, and I know why they died. And I know why certain people in this town want to keep you quiet." He stood and walked to the altar, returning with a heavy brass candlestick. Without ceremony, he brought it down on the chain links with enough force to send sparks flying through the air. "What are you doing?" Sarah gasped. "Getting you out of here," Marcus replied, striking the chains again. "And then we're going to have a very long conversation about your parents, about what they discovered, and about why the good people of Cedar Falls would rather chain a 17-year-old girl in a chapel than let the truth come to light." Chains finally gave way with a metallic snap that seemed to echo through the entire chapel. Sarah rubbed her raw ankles and looked up at this man who had appeared like an avenging angel in the midst of her darkest hour. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she didn't have much choice. Marcus extended his hand to help her up, and when she took it, his grip was warm and steady. "Because your parents trusted me. Because they were working with me when they died. And because I made them a promise that if anything happened to them, I would make sure their daughters were safe." Sarah felt the world tilt around her as the implications of his words sank in. "Working with you on what?" Marcus's face grew grim as he helped her to her feet. "On exposing the biggest corruption scandal this county has ever seen. Your parents weren't just innocent victims of a drunk driver, Sarah. They were murdered because they got too close to the truth." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the chapel, a different kind of tempest was about to be unleashed. Sarah looked into Marcus Thornfield's eyes and saw her own determination reflected back at her. Whatever had killed her parents, whatever. Conspiracy had cost them their lives and landed her in chains. She was no longer facing it alone. The first battle had been won, but the war for truth and justice was just beginning. The old cemetery behind St. Mercy's Chapel had been abandoned. For nearly 50 years, its weathered headstones tilting at odd angles like broken teeth in the moonlight. Marcus led Sarah and Rosa through the maze of crumbling monuments, their footsteps muffled by the soggy ground and the lingering drizzle from the passing storm. "Here," Marcus whispered, stopping beside a large granite mausoleum bearing the name Whitmore. The structure was elaborate for such a small town, with carved angels and intricate stonework that spoke of wealth and status from a bygone era. Marcus produced a crowbar from his coat and inserted it into what looked like a natural crack in the stone. With a grinding sound that made Sarah wince, a section of the mausoleum's back wall swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. The Whitmore family built this as their private entrance to the tunnel system back in 1887. Marcus explained as he pulled out 3 flashlights from his pack. Old Cornelius Whitmore was paranoid about Indian attacks and wanted a way to reach the chapel without being seen from the main road. Rosa tested her flashlight and shook her head. Indians weren't the ones he should have been worried about. That man had so many enemies in town. He probably needed the tunnel just to get to Sunday service without being shot. Sarah peered into the darkness beyond the opening. The tunnel stretched away into blackness, its walls lined with rough-hewn stone that glistened with moisture. The air that drifted out smelled of earth and age and something else she couldn't quite identify. "How far does it go?" she asked. "About 200 yards. It connects to a larger tunnel that runs directly under the chapel's foundation. Your father and I spent weeks mapping out the entire system." Marcus swung his pack onto his shoulders and checked his watch. "It's almost midnight. Father Morrison should be fast asleep by now." They crawled through the opening one by one, with Marcus leading the way and Rosa bringing up the rear. The tunnel was narrow and cramped, forcing them to move in a hunched crouch that quickly made Sarah's back ache. The beam of her flashlight danced ahead of her, illuminating rough stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the tunnel opened into a larger underground chamber. Sarah straightened gratefully, playing her light around the space. The chamber was maybe 15 feet square, with several other tunnels branching off in different directions. The walls were lined with wooden shelves that held various supplies: lanterns, rope, tools, and sealed containers of what looked like food and water. "Emergency supply depot," Marcus explained, noticing her curiosity. "The town founders built these all over the tunnel system in case of siege or disaster. Most people have forgotten they exist, but they're still functional after all these years." Rosa moved to one of the containers and pulled out a rolled piece of paper. "Map of the tunnel system," she said, spreading it out on a wooden crate. "Your papa helped update this with all the changes they made over the years." Sarah studied the map by flashlight, amazed at the scope of the underground network. Tunnels connected not just the chapel and cemetery, but also the old courthouse, the bank, several prominent homes, and even the train station on the edge of town. Red X's marked locations where tunnels had collapsed or been deliberately sealed. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered. "It's like a whole secret city under Cedar Falls." "The town used to be much more prosperous," Marcus said, rolling up the map. "Back when the silver mines were operational and the railroad brought through traffic. The tunnel system was essential for moving goods and people during the harsh winters. They chose the tunnel marked Chapel Basement Access and began the final leg of their journey. This passage was wider than the first, allowing them to walk upright, but it felt older and less stable. Several times they had to climb over sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed, and Sarah could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. As they walked, Rosa told Sarah stories about her parents that helped pass the time and ease the tension. She spoke about Maria Williams's beautiful garden, how she had taught Rosa to grow vegetables that could survive the Montana climate. She described David Williams's passion for his work, how he would stay up late into the night poring over environmental reports and scientific papers. "Your mama was pregnant once before you were born," Rosa said quietly as they navigated around a section of fallen stone. "A little boy. But the baby was born with serious problems, defects that the doctors couldn't explain. He lived only 3 days." Sarah stopped walking. "I never knew I had a brother. Your parents didn't like to talk about it. Too painful. But I always wondered if that baby's problems had something to do with the contamination. Your family lived even closer to the mining sites back then." Marcus's voice drifted back from ahead of them. "That's what convinced your father to take the job with the State Environmental Office. He wanted to make sure no other families went through what yours did." The tunnel began to slope upward, and soon they could see a faint rectangle of light ahead. Marcus held up his hand for them to stop and moved forward alone to investigate. He returned a moment later with a satisfied expression. "We're directly under the chapel basement. The entrance is hidden behind the old coal bin. Father Morrison is nowhere to be seen, and the chapel is empty." They climbed through the hidden opening and found themselves in a dusty basement that smelled of old wood and religious candles. The space was filled with stored church furniture, boxes of hymnals, and various religious artifacts. Marcus led them to the far corner, where a large wooden cabinet stood against the stone wall. "Help me move this," he said, and together the three of them shifted the heavy piece of furniture aside, revealing what looked like a solid stone wall behind it. Marcus ran his hands along the stones until he found what he was looking for, a section where the mortar was a slightly different color. He pressed against several stones in a specific sequence, and suddenly a portion of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. "Your father was brilliant at this kind of thing," Marcus said as they stared into the secret compartment beyond. "He could make a hiding place that would fool anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it." The hidden chamber was small but meticulously organized. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates and case numbers. A desk sat in the center of the space, its surface covered with maps, photographs, and scientific equipment. Everything was sealed in plastic to protect it from moisture and time. Sarah moved to the desk and picked up one of the photographs. It showed a stream running through farmland, but the water was an unnatural reddish-brown color, and dead fish floated on its surface. The date stamp indicated it had been taken just 3 months before her parents died. "This is Beaver Creek," Rosa said, looking over Sarah's shoulder. "It runs right through the Johnson farm. Their cattle started dying last spring, but the veterinarian couldn't figure out why." Marcus was already pulling files from the cabinets, his movements quick and efficient. "We need to take everything. Once Father Morrison discovers you're missing from the chapel, they'll search every inch of this building." As they worked to gather the evidence, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the scope of her parents' investigation. There were hundreds of documents, chemical analysis reports, medical records, correspondence with EPA officials, and photographs of environmental damage that stretched across multiple counties. One file contained a list of names under the heading "Compromised Officials." Sarah recognized many of them: Sheriff Coleman, Judge Harrison, Mayor Patricia Livingston, and dozens of others. Beside each name was a dollar amount and dates of payments from Clearwater Mining Company. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a bank record. "Sheriff Coleman received $250,000 last year alone. Judge Harrison got even more." Rosa shook her head in disgust. "No wonder they were so eager to declare your parents' deaths an accident. They couldn't afford to have anyone looking too closely at what really happened." Marcus had found what he was looking for, a thick file labeled Federal Evidence Package, copy 1 of 3. Inside were summary documents that tied together all the individual pieces of evidence into a comprehensive case against Clearwater and their political allies. "Your father was smart enough to make multiple copies," Marcus explained. This is one. I have another hidden at my ranch, and the third was supposed to go to an FBI contact in Billings. What happened to the third copy? Your parents were carrying it with them the night they died. It was probably destroyed in the crash, or taken by whoever cleaned up the scene afterward. As they continued gathering documents, Sarah discovered a folder that made her blood run cold. It contained medical records for dozens of children in Cedar Falls and the surrounding area, all showing signs of developmental problems, cancers, and birth defects consistent with toxic chemical exposure. Among the records was a death certificate for a 3-day-old infant named Michael David Williams. "My brother," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking as she read the document. The cause of death was listed as multiple congenital abnormalities consistent with environmental toxin exposure. Rosa put her arm around Sarah's shoulders. Your parents never stopped blaming themselves, even though they had no way of knowing about the contamination back then. That's why your papa was so determined to stop Clearwater. He didn't want any other families to go through what yours did. Suddenly, they heard footsteps overhead, followed by the sound of the chapel's main door opening and closing. Marcus immediately switched off his flashlight and motioned for the others to do the same. "Someone's upstairs," he breathed. They waited in tense silence as the footsteps moved around the chapel floor above them. Sarah could hear muffled voices, at least 2 people, maybe more. "Check the basement," a man's voice said, clearly audible through the old wooden floors. If the girl was here, there might be signs. Marcus quickly began shoving files into his pack, while Rosa and Sarah gathered the most important documents. They had maybe 30 seconds before whoever was upstairs made it down to the basement. "The tunnel," Marcus whispered urgently. "Move." They scrambled toward the hidden entrance, but just as Sarah was about to duck into the opening, she heard a voice that made her freeze in terror. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, that girl knows something." The way she was asking questions around town, somebody must have told her about her parents' real work. It was Father Morrison, and he was talking to Sheriff Coleman. "Maybe," the sheriff replied, "but she's just a kid. How much could she really know?" "Enough to be dangerous. Mrs. Pemberton should have kept a closer eye on her at the orphanage. If Marcus Thornfield has gotten to her." The voices were getting closer to the basement stairs. Marcus pushed Sarah toward the tunnel entrance, but she hesitated. "Wait," she whispered. "I want to hear what they're saying." "Sarah, we need to go now," but it was too late. The basement door creaked open, and they could see the glow of flashlights starting down the wooden stairs. Marcus made a quick decision. Instead of fleeing through the tunnel, he pressed Sarah and Rosa back into the shadows behind the moved cabinet, pulling out a pistol from his coat. "If they find us," he whispered so quietly Sarah could barely hear him, "I want you to run for the tunnel no matter what happens to me. Get this evidence to the FBI and make sure the world knows the truth." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the men upstairs could hear it. In her hands, she clutched the file containing the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy that had killed her parents and was poisoning thousands of innocent people. The footsteps reached the bottom of the basement stairs, and flashlight beams began sweeping across the stored furniture and boxes. Sarah closed her eyes and prayed that the shadows would be enough to hide them, because if Father Morrison and Sheriff Coleman discovered them here, she knew they would never make it. Out of the chapel alive, the flashlight beams swept across the basement like searchlights, probing every corner and shadow. Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall behind the cabinet, barely daring to breathe as Sheriff Coleman's heavy boots descended the wooden stairs with deliberate slowness. "Dust patterns look disturbed over here," Coleman's gravelly voice echoed through the basement. "Someone's been moving things around recently." Father Morrison's lighter footsteps followed. The girl was clever enough to ask uncomfortable questions around town. Perhaps she inherited more than just her father's stubbornness. Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her, his grip tightening on the pistol. Through a gap in the cabinet, she could see the sheriff's bulky silhouette as he methodically examined the basement's contents. Coleman was a large man who had run Cedar Falls with an iron fist for over 20 years, and his reputation for violence was well known throughout the county. "Look at this," Coleman said, his flashlight beam falling on the area where they had moved the cabinet. Fresh scratches on the floor. Something heavy was dragged across here. The two men moved closer to their hiding spot, and Sarah could smell the sheriff's cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the evidence files to her chest. "Should we move this cabinet?" Father Morrison asked. "Might as well. If someone's been nosing around down here, we need to know what they were after." Sarah closed her eyes and prepared for discovery, but suddenly a different voice called down from the chapel above. Sheriff Coleman. "You down there?" Coleman paused, his hand already on the cabinet. "What is it, Deputy? We just got word from the orphanage. The Williams girl is definitely missing. Mrs. Pemberton found her bed empty and the window open. Looks like she climbed out during the storm." "Damn it," Coleman muttered. "Morrison, we need to organize a search party. If that girl is running around loose with whatever she knows." Father Morrison's voice carried a cold edge. "She won't get far. This is a small town, and we have eyes everywhere. The question is whether she's alone or if someone helped her escape." The men began moving back toward the stairs, but Coleman stopped suddenly. "You know what? Let's check behind this cabinet anyway. Won't take but a minute." Sarah felt her world about to collapse, but then another voice shouted from upstairs, this one urgent and panicked. "Sheriff, fire at the Riverside Orphanage. Emma Williams is trapped inside." The effect was instantaneous. Coleman abandoned the cabinet and ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time. "Morrison, come on. If something happens to that other kid, we'll have federal investigators crawling all over this place." Father Morrison hesitated for a moment, his flashlight beam lingering on the cabinet, but then followed the sheriff upstairs. Within moments, Sarah could hear car engines starting and vehicles racing away from the chapel. They waited in the darkness for several long minutes before Marcus finally spoke. "That was too convenient," he said quietly. "Rosa, did you arrange for a distraction?" "See," Rosa's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "I called in the fire report from a payphone on my way here. The orphanage isn't really burning, but by the time they figure that out, we'll be long gone." Sarah felt a surge of admiration for the older woman's quick thinking, but her relief was short-lived. Wait, what about Emma? If they realized the fire report was fake, they might take it out on her. "Already taken care of, Mia," Rosa assured her. "My cousin Elena works the night shift at the orphanage. She makes sure Emma is safe and has an alibi for why she couldn't have climbed out any window." Marcus was already moving toward the tunnel entrance. "We need to get out of here now. They'll be back once they realize they've been played, and next time they'll bring more men." They gathered the remaining evidence files and slipped back into the hidden passage. The return journey through the tunnels felt different now, more urgent, more dangerous. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow potentially hiding an enemy dot as they made their way through the underground maze. Marcus filled them in on what needed to happen next. "I have contacts at the FBI field office in Billings," he said as they navigated around a section of collapsed ceiling. "Agent Patricia Hayes has been investigating political corruption in Montana for years. She's one of the few federal agents I trust to handle this without it getting buried or leaked back to Clearwater." Sarah stumbled over a loose stone, still processing everything she had learned. "How do we know we can trust her?" "Because she's been trying to build a case against Senator Blackwood for 3 years. Your parents' evidence is exactly what she needs to finally bring him down." They emerged from the cemetery tunnel into the pre-dawn darkness. The storm had passed completely, leaving the air crisp and clean. Stars were visible overhead for the first time in days, and the eastern horizon showed the first pale hints of sunrise. Marcus led them to where he had hidden fresh horses in a grove of trees near the cemetery. As they mounted up, Sarah couldn't help but look back at the chapel where she had been chained just hours earlier. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "Where are we going?" she asked as they began riding away from Cedar Falls. "My ranch first, to collect the second copy of the evidence," Marcus replied. "Then we'll head for Billings. It's a 6-hour ride, but we'll be there before Clearwater realizes what we're doing." As they rode through the Montana countryside, Rosa began telling Sarah more about the network of people who had been working to expose the conspiracy. There were farmers whose livestock had been poisoned, doctors who had noticed the unusual cancer patterns, and even some government workers who had tried to blow the whistle only to find themselves transferred or fired. "Your parents weren't working alone," Rosa explained as her horse kept pace with Sarah's. "There are good people everywhere who want the truth to come out, but they've been afraid to act because they've seen what happens to those who speak up." The sun was rising as they reached the Thornfield Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. But as they crested the hill overlooking the property, Marcus suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. "Something's wrong," he said grimly. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him. Several black SUVs were parked in front of the main house, and men in dark suits were visible moving around the property. "Clearwater Security," Marcus spat. "They must have figured out I was involved when they discovered you were missing." Rosa pointed toward the barn. "There's smoke coming from behind the building." Marcus's face went pale. "They're burning the evidence. The bastards are destroying everything." As they watched from the hilltop, one of the men in suits emerged from the house, carrying what looked like boxes of documents. He threw them onto a bonfire that was already consuming other materials behind the barn. "Can we get to the hiding place without being seen?" Sarah asked. Marcus shook his head. "The evidence was hidden in the barn's foundation. They've probably already found it." He turned his horse away from the ranch. "We'll have to make do with what we collected from the chapel." As they rode away from the burning ranch, Sarah felt a crushing sense of defeat. They had risked everything to retrieve the evidence, and now most of it was being destroyed before their eyes. But Rosa surprised her with a knowing smile. "Don't look so worried, Mia. Marcus isn't the only one who knows how to hide things." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a metal briefcase that Sarah hadn't noticed before. "Your papa was paranoid about keeping all the evidence in just 2 places. He gave me a 3rd copy 6 months ago and made me promise to hide it somewhere even Marcus didn't know about." Marcus stared at the briefcase in amazement. "David never told me about a 3rd copy. He said if something happened to both of you, at least Sarah would still have someone she could trust." Rosa's eyes were bright with tears. "Your papa knew. This day might come, Mia. He prepared for it." Sarah felt a surge of emotion as she realized the lengths her father had gone to in order to protect the truth. Even in death, he was still looking out for his daughters and fighting for justice. "So we still have everything we need to take down Clearwater and Senator Blackwood?" Sarah asked. Marcus nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We have enough evidence to put half the county's leadership in federal prison, but now they know we're coming for them." The ride to Billings just got a lot more dangerous. As if to emphasize his point, they heard the sound of helicopters in the distance. Black aircraft were rising from the direction of Cedar Falls, spreading out across the countryside in what was obviously a search pattern. "They're not taking any chances," Rosa observed. Marcus urged his horse to a faster pace. "There's an old mining road through the mountains that will keep us hidden from aerial surveillance. It's rough going, but it's our best chance of reaching Billings without being intercepted." As they rode toward the mountains, Sarah found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a powerless orphan asking uncomfortable questions. Now she was carrying evidence that could topple a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in Montana. The helicopters were getting closer, their rotors beating a steady rhythm across the morning sky. Sarah knew that Clearwater and their allies would stop at nothing to prevent the truth from coming out. They had already committed murder to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. But for the first time since her parents' death, Sarah felt like she was finally fighting back. She was no longer a victim of circumstances beyond her control. She was her father's daughter, carrying on his work and his principles. The mountain road stretched ahead of them, winding through dense forests and rocky terrain that would provide cover from their pursuers. It would be a dangerous journey, but at the end of it waited Agent Hayes and the possibility of justice for all the innocent people who had suffered at Clearwater's hands. As they disappeared into the trees, the helicopters passed overhead, their pilots unaware that their quarry had already slipped through their fingers. The hunt was on, but Sarah Williams and her allies were not going down without a fight. Next few hours would determine whether truth and justice could triumph over corruption and greed, or whether the conspiracy that had killed her parents would claim even more victims before the day was done. The old mining road carved a treacherous path through the Glacier National Forest, its narrow switchbacks barely wide enough for their horses. Sarah gripped her reins tightly as her mount navigated loose rocks and steep drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into pine-covered valleys below. Marcus led the way with the confidence of someone who had traveled these forgotten trails many times before. Behind him, Rosa maintained a steady pace despite her age, while Sarah brought up the rear, constantly glancing over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. "How much further to the main highway?" Sarah called out as they paused at a rocky outcropping that offered a brief respite from the climbing. "Another 4 hours to reach the old lumber camp," Marcus replied, consulting a worn topographical map. "From there, we can follow the service roads down to Highway 2. The FBI field office is about an hour's drive from there." Rosa dismounted and stretched her back, wincing slightly. "Assuming we can find transportation once we reach civilization. These horses weren't built for highway travel." Sarah looked back down the mountain trail they had just climbed. Through the gaps in the trees, she could see dust clouds rising from multiple points in the valley below. Their pursuers had abandoned the helicopters in favor of ground vehicles, and were systematically searching every possible escape route. "They're persistent," she observed grimly. Marcus followed her gaze. "Clearwater has millions of dollars at stake, not to mention Senator Blackwood's entire political career. They'll throw everything they have at stopping us." As they prepared to continue their climb, the distant sound of engines echoed through the mountain air. But these weren't coming from the valley below. They were coming from ahead, from the direction they were traveling. "Roadblock," Marcus said, his hand moving instinctively to his pistol. "They've got us caught between two forces." Rosa pointed to a narrow deer trail that branched off from the main road, leading deeper into the wilderness. "What about that path? Where does it go?" Marcus studied his map, tracing the contour lines with his finger. "It leads to an abandoned mining settlement called Copper Creek, ghost town for the past 60 years. There might be shelter there, but it's a dead end. We'd be trapped." The sound of engines was getting closer from both directions now. Sarah could hear the distinctive rumble of motorcycles mixed with the higher whine of all-terrain vehicles, all designed for exactly this kind of terrain. "We can't outrun them on horseback," Sarah said, stating the obvious. "And we can't fight them all." Marcus made a quick decision. "Copper Creek it is. At least there we can find cover and maybe find another way out on foot." They urged their tired horses onto the deer trail, which immediately became even more treacherous. Ancient mine tailings had turned sections of the path into loose gravel that shifted dangerously under the horses' hooves. Rusted pieces of old mining equipment jutted from the undergrowth like metal bones, and more than once they had to dismount and lead their horses around obstacles, The ghost town of Copper Creek materialized through the trees like something from a fever dream. Weathered wooden buildings leaned at impossible angles, their roofs caved in and walls punctured by decades of harsh weather. A few structures remained relatively intact, what looked like an old assay office, a general store, and a large building that might have been a boarding house for miners. There, Marcus pointed to the boarding house. That building has a stone foundation and thick walls. If we have to make a stand, that's our best option. They led their horses into the building through what had once been the main entrance. The interior was a maze of collapsed furniture and debris, but the basic structure was sound. Rosa immediately began looking for alternate exits, while Marcus positioned himself near a window that offered a view of the trail they had just traveled. Sarah opened Rosa's briefcase and began spreading the evidence documents across an old table, making sure everything was organized and accessible. If something happened to them, she wanted whoever found their bodies to understand what they had died protecting. "Look at this," she said, holding up a document she hadn't seen before. "It's a shipping manifest from Clearwater. They've been transporting toxic waste to disposal sites in 3 different states, but the chemical signatures don't match what they're claiming to be shipping." Rosa glanced over from where she was examining what looked like an old mine shaft entrance. "What kind of chemicals?" Sarah read from the manifest. "Radioactive materials, heavy metals, industrial solvents that are banned for disposal in the United States." She looked up, her face pale. "They're not just poisoning the groundwater in Montana. They're shipping this stuff all over the country." Marcus whistled low. "No wonder they're willing to kill to keep this quiet. We're not just talking about environmental violations anymore. This is interstate transportation of illegal hazardous materials. Federal prosecutors would have a field day with this." The sound of engines suddenly grew much louder, and through the broken windows they could see dust clouds approaching through the trees. Their pursuers had found the deer trail. "How many?" Rosa asked, moving to another window. Marcus counted the vehicles as they emerged from the forest. 6 motorcycles, 3 ATVs, and ... Nam. That's a military-style Humvee bringing up the rear. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Military? Is Clearwater working with the government? "Private security contractors," Marcus corrected. "Ex-military mercenaries who work for whoever pays the most. Clearwater's been using them for asset protection for years." The vehicles spread out in a semicircle around the ghost town, effectively cutting off any escape route except the mine shaft Rosa had discovered. Men in tactical gear began dismounting from the vehicles, their weapons clearly visible. A bullhorn crackled to life from one of the vehicles. "Marcus Thornfield, we know you're in there. Send out the girl and the documents, and nobody has to get hurt." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Right, just like nobody got hurt when they murdered David and Maria Williams." Rosa had disappeared into the mine shaft and now returned with a grim expression. "The shaft goes back about 50 yards before it's completely flooded. No way out that direction." Sarah looked around the decrepit building, feeling the walls closing in both literally and figuratively. They were trapped with evidence that could expose one of the biggest corruption scandals in American history, but they were about to be killed before they could deliver it to the authorities. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "My parents didn't die just so we could give up now." The bullhorn sounded again. "You have 5 minutes to come out peacefully. After that, we're coming in, and we won't be responsible for what happens." Marcus checked his pistol and the 2 spare magazines he carried. 30 rounds total, against maybe 20 armed mercenaries. The math doesn't work in our favor. But Rosa was studying an old mining map that hung on the wall, its edges yellowed and torn but still partially legible. "Wait," she said, tracing a line with her finger. "This shows a ventilation shaft that connects to the main tunnel system. If it's still open." She led them to a corner of the building where a pile of old machinery had been stacked against the wall. Together, they moved the rusty equipment aside, revealing a circular opening barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "Where does it lead?" Sarah asked, peering into the darkness. "According to this map, it connects to the main mining tunnel that runs under the entire mountain. There are exit points all along the valley on the other side." Marcus was already gathering the evidence files. "It's worth a try. Anything's better than waiting here to be slaughtered." The sound of approaching footsteps and shouted orders made the decision for them. Rosa went first, squeezing through the narrow opening with surprising agility. Sarah followed, clutching the briefcase containing her father's life work. The ventilation shaft was a nightmare of claustrophobic darkness. Ancient timbers creaked ominously overhead, and more than once Sarah had to squeeze through sections where cave-ins had nearly blocked the passage entirely. The air was stale and thick with the smell of decay and standing water. Behind her, she could hear Marcus cursing as he struggled to fit his larger frame through the tight spaces. Further back, the sound of gunfire erupted as the mercenaries discovered their hiding place and began shooting at shadows. "Keep moving," Marcus called softly. "They'll figure out where we went soon enough." The shaft seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the mountain's interior like the intestines of some ancient beast. Sarah's knees and elbows were scraped raw from crawling over rough stone, and her jacket was torn in multiple places. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, the shaft opened into a much larger tunnel. Sarah tumbled out of the opening and found herself in what had obviously been the main mining operation. The tunnel was tall enough to stand in, with rusty rail tracks running along the floor and massive wooden support beams holding up the ceiling. Rosa was already on her feet, brushing dirt from her clothes. According to the map, this tunnel runs for about 2 miles before reaching the eastern exit. From there, we should be able to reach the highway. As Marcus emerged from the ventilation shaft, they heard the distant sound of voices echoing through the tunnels behind them. Their pursuers had discovered the escape route. "Move," Marcus said simply. They began jogging along the old rail line, their footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. Emergency lanterns that had been left behind by the mining company still hung from the support beams, and Marcus managed to get a few of them working, providing enough light to navigate safely. As they ran, Sarah found herself thinking about the generations of miners who had worked in these tunnels, risking their lives every day to extract copper from the mountain's depths. How many of them had died in cave-ins or explosions or industrial accidents? Also, wealthy investors could profit from their labor. It wasn't so different from what Clearwater was doing to the people of Cedar Falls and the surrounding counties. The powerful had always been willing to sacrifice the innocent in pursuit of greater profits. The tunnel began to slope upward, and fresher air carried the scent of pine trees and mountain streams. Ahead they could see natural light filtering down from what looked like the exit, but as they approached the opening, Marcus suddenly held up his hand for them to stop. "Listen," he whispered over the sound of their own breathing. They could hear engines idling outside the tunnel entrance. Clearwater's mercenaries had anticipated their escape route and positioned vehicles at both ends of the tunnel system. They were trapped underground with armed killers, closing in from behind and waiting for them ahead. The evidence that could expose the conspiracy and bring justice for Sarah's parents was still safely in Rosa's briefcase, but it wouldn't matter if they couldn't survive long enough to deliver it. Sarah looked at Marcus and Rosa, these brave people, who had risked everything to help her uncover the truth. Whatever happened next, she was grateful that she hadn't faced this alone. "Any ideas?" she asked quietly. Marcus checked his watch. "It's almost noon. If we can hold out until dark, we might be able to slip past them under cover of darkness." Rosa nodded toward the sounds of pursuit echoing through the tunnel behind them. "That's assuming they don't find us first." Sarah clutched the briefcase tighter, feeling the weight of responsibility it represented. Somewhere in these documents was the key to bringing down Senator Blackwood and the Clearwater Mining Company, to getting justice for her parents and all the other innocent victims of their greed. She just had to stay alive long enough to deliver it. Deep in the bowels of the abandoned copper mine, Sarah huddled against the cold stone wall while Marcus and Rosa worked frantically to find another way out. The sound of their pursuers grew closer with each passing minute, boots splashing through puddles and voices calling out coordinates as the mercenaries systematically searched every side tunnel and alcove. "There has to be another way," Sarah whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. The miners who worked here must have had emergency exits. Rosa was examining another faded map she had found tacked to one of the support beams. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of dotted lines that seemed to branch off from the main tunnel. "These look like ventilation shafts, but they're marked differently from the one we came through." Marcus studied the map by flashlight. "Those aren't ventilation shafts. They're escape routes. Mining companies were required to build them after the big disasters in Colorado and Nevada. Where do they lead?" "This one here," Marcus traced a line with his finger, "appears to exit near an old forestry service road about a mile north of the main entrance, if we can reach it." A shout echoed through the tunnel behind them, followed by the beam of a powerful searchlight. Their pursuers had found the main tunnel and were moving fast. "No more time for planning," Marcus said, shouldering his pack. "We go now or we don't go at all." The escape tunnel Marcus had identified was hidden behind a false wall that looked like it had been built to conceal it from casual discovery. It took precious seconds to find the hidden latch and swing the panel aside, revealing a narrow passage that sloped steeply upward into darkness. Sarah went first this time, the briefcase strapped to her back like a backpack. The tunnel was even tighter than the ventilation shaft had been, forcing her to crawl on her belly through sections where the ceiling had sagged over the decades. Behind her, she could hear Rosa's labored breathing as the older woman struggled with the physical demands of the escape. Further back, Marcus's bulk made scraping sounds against the tunnel walls as he forced his way through passages that had clearly been designed for smaller men. "Keep going," Marcus called softly when Sarah paused at a particularly narrow section. "I can hear them in the main tunnel. They found where we entered." The escape route twisted and turned through the mountain's interior, following natural fissures and man-made excavations that seemed to defy any logical engineering principles. Several times they had to navigate around sections where groundwater had carved new channels through the rock, leaving pools of stagnant water that soaked their clothes and chilled them to the bone. As they climbed, Sarah began to hear new sounds filtering down from above: the rumble of heavy vehicles, the static of radio communications, and voices shouting orders. Clearwater had brought in reinforcements and was positioning them at every possible exit point they could identify. "They're not taking any chances," she panted as they paused at a junction where the tunnel split into 3 different directions. Rosa consulted the map again, though it was becoming increasingly difficult to correlate their actual position with the faded markings. "I think we want the middle passage," she said uncertainly, "but I'm not completely sure." Marcus made the decision for them. "Middle it is." "We don't have time to debate." The chosen tunnel proved to be the right one, as they soon began to detect fresher air flowing down from above. But with the improved air quality came a new problem: voices very close and getting closer. Checkpoint Alpha is secure. No sign of them at the main entrance. Roger that. Checkpoint Bravo reporting all clear at the Forestry Road junction. Keep your eyes open. These people are resourceful, and they've got help from someone who knows these mountains. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the implications. Clearwater's forces had identified and secured the very exit they were heading toward. The escape tunnel was leading them directly into the arms of their enemies. Marcus apparently reached the same conclusion. "We need to find another way out," he whispered, But as they tried to retreat back down the tunnel, the sound of pursuit from below grew louder. Flashlight beams were now visible in the passage behind them, and they could hear radio chatter as the mercenaries coordinated their search. They were trapped in the middle of the tunnel system with nowhere to go but forward into the arms of the checkpoint team. That's when Rosa noticed something that changed everything. "Wait," she said, examining the tunnel wall more closely. "This isn't natural rock formation here. Someone carved this by hand and recently." Marcus brought his flashlight closer to where Rosa was pointing. The tunnel wall showed clear evidence of recent excavation, with tool marks that were too fresh to be from the original mining operation. "Back inside," Marcus ordered, and they retreated into the utility building, just as the helicopters passed overhead. Through the building's small windows, they watched as the aircraft hovered over the forest, their crews obviously searching for any signs of movement below. Sarah held her breath as one helicopter descended to tree level directly above their hiding place, its rotors creating a thunderous noise that seemed to shake the entire structure. After what felt like an eternity, the helicopters moved on to search other areas. But their presence confirmed what Sarah had already suspected. Clearwater wasn't giving up the hunt. They were throwing everything they had at finding and silencing the three fugitives. "We need transportation," Rosa said practically. "We can't outrun helicopters on foot." Marcus was already thinking along the same lines. That dirt road has to lead somewhere. If Clearwater's been using it to access this facility, there might be vehicles stashed nearby. They followed the tire tracks through the forest, moving carefully, to avoid making noise or leaving obvious signs of their passage. The road wound through dense woodland for about half a mile before emerging into another clearing where a camouflaged garage had been built into the hillside. The garage door was the garage had been built into the hillside, secured with a heavy padlock, but Marcus's crowbar made quick work of it. Inside, they found exactly what they were hoping for, a collection of civilian vehicles that looked like they belonged to local residents rather than a paramilitary organization. "Stolen cars," Rosa observed, examining the mismatched collection of pickup trucks, sedans, and SUVs, probably taken from people who asked too many questions. Sarah felt a chill as she realized they were looking at vehicles that had belonged to Clearwater's victims. How many families had lost loved ones whose cars ended up in this hidden garage? Marcus selected a dark blue pickup truck that looked reliable and had Montana plates. "Keys are in the ignition." They weren't expecting anyone to find this place. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something that made her stop in her tracks. Hanging on a pegboard near the garage entrance were personal items that had obviously been taken from the vehicles: wallets, purses, jewelry, and photographs. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed a family of 4 standing in front of a farmhouse: a man, a woman, and 2 young children. The notation on the back read, "Henderson family, eliminated. The 12th of July 2022. Ask questions about cattle deaths." "The Hendersons," Sarah whispered, remembering a news story from the previous year about a family that had died in a house fire. "They said it was an electrical problem, but ... Marcus looked at the photograph over her shoulder. "But now we know better. Clearwater has been eliminating entire families." Rosa was examining other items on the pegboard, her face growing paler with each discovery. There must be evidence here from dozens of victims. Wedding rings, family photos, children's toys. Sarah felt rage building inside her as she looked at the collection of stolen memories. These weren't just statistics or names on a surveillance board. These were real people with families and dreams, all destroyed by corporate greed. "We take everything," she said firmly. "Every piece of evidence in this garage comes with us. These people deserve justice too." They loaded boxes of personal effects and documents into the pickup truck, along with Rosa's briefcase containing the original evidence. The truck's cargo bed was soon filled with proof of Clearwater's systematic murder. Campaign. Marcus started the engine and pulled out of the hidden garage, following the dirt road as it wound through the mountains toward the main highway. The truck handled the rough terrain well, but Sarah kept watching the sky for helicopters and the road behind them for pursuing vehicles. "How long until we reach the FBI office?" she asked as they finally connected with a paved road. "About 3 hours if we don't run into trouble," Marcus replied. "But I'm not optimistic about avoiding trouble. Clearwater has resources we haven't even seen yet." As if summoned by his words, Sarah spotted a black SUV in the truck's side mirror, maintaining a steady distance behind them but clearly following their route. "We've got company," she announced. Marcus checked the mirror and cursed under his breath. "One vehicle, but that probably means there are others. They're herding us toward something." The highway stretched ahead through rolling hills and scattered forests with very few places to hide or seek help. The nearest town was still an hour away, and they had no way of knowing how many of the local authorities were on Clearwater's payroll. Rosa was studying a road map she had found in the truck's glove compartment. "There's a truck stop about 20 miles ahead. Lots of people, multiple exit routes. If we're going to make a stand, that might be our best option." But as they approached the truck stop, it became clear that Clearwater had anticipated this move. As well, black vehicles were positioned at multiple points around the facility, and Sarah could see armed men trying to blend in with the civilian truck drivers and travelers. "It's a trap," Marcus said, driving past the truck stop without stopping. "They're waiting for us." The black SUV behind them maintained its distance, content to follow rather than confront them directly. Sarah realized that Clearwater's strategy had changed. They were no longer trying to capture or kill the fugitives immediately. They were waiting for something. "They're not trying to stop us," she said suddenly. "They're following us to see where we're going. They want to know if we have allies, safe houses, or other people helping us." Marcus understood the implication immediately. "If we lead them to Agent Hayes, we'll be putting her life in danger too." Rosa folded the map and looked at both of them seriously. "Then we don't go to Agent Hayes, at least not directly. We need to find another way to get this evidence to the FBI without compromising their investigation." As they continued driving through the Montana countryside, Sarah found herself thinking about the scope of what they had uncovered. Clearwater's conspiracy wasn't just about environmental crimes or political corruption. It was about the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their operation, using resources and methods that suggested connections far beyond a simple mining company. "Who else is involved in this?" she asked out loud. Clearwater couldn't have built that underground facility or acquired military-grade surveillance equipment without help from federal sources. Marcus had been wondering the same thing. Senator Blackwood is just the tip of the iceberg. This operation has been running for over a decade, which means it spans multiple political administrations and involves people at very high levels of government. The implications were staggering. If Clearwater had allies within federal law enforcement agencies, then simply contacting the FBI might not be enough. They needed to find someone they could trust absolutely, someone whose integrity was beyond question. Rosa suggested an alternative approach. "What about the media? Investigative journalists who specialize in exposing government corruption. The evidence is so explosive that any major news organization would have to take it seriously," Sarah agreed. "But how do we contact them without Clearwater intercepting our communications?" As they debated their options, the black SUV behind them was joined by 2 more vehicles, creating a convoy that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Other drivers on the highway were starting to notice the unusual procession, and Sarah worried that innocent bystanders might get caught in whatever confrontation was building. Marcus made a sudden decision, taking an exit ramp that led toward a small farming community called Riverside Junction. The pursuing vehicles followed, but the narrow country roads limited their ability to coordinate an attack. "Where are we going?" Rosa asked. "To level the playing field," Marcus replied grimly. "Clearwater thinks they can intimidate us by following. In plain sight. Time to show them that two can play that game." Riverside Junction was exactly what its name suggested. A small collection of buildings clustered around the intersection of two rural highways. But Marcus seemed to know exactly where he was going, pulling into the parking lot of what looked like an abandoned gas station. "This used to be owned by a friend of mine," he explained as they got out of the truck. "Tommy Reeves, a former Army Ranger who came back from Afghanistan with some very specific skills." Behind the gas station, hidden from view of the road, sat a modified pickup truck that looked like it had been designed for warfare rather than transportation. Armor plating covered the windows and body panels, and Sarah could see mounting points for weapons that had been removed but could easily be reinstalled. "Tommy's been expecting trouble from Clearwater for months," Marcus continued. "His farm is downwind from one of their worst contamination sites, and his livestock started dying last spring." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a lean man with graying hair and steady eyes emerged from the gas station's building. Tommy Reeves moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked him as someone who had seen combat and survived. "Marcus." Tommy nodded as he approached. "Heard you might be coming this way. Also heard you've stirred up quite a hornet's nest." Marcus indicated the black vehicles that had pulled off the highway and were now positioned where they could watch the gas station. "Clearwater's mercenaries. They've been hunting us since last night." Tommy studied the pursuing vehicles with professional interest. Military contractors, by the look of their positioning. Probably ex-special forces, but they're operating in civilian territory without proper legal authority. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized they had found someone with both the skills and the motivation to help them fight back against Clearwater's forces. "Can you help us reach the FBI?" she asked. "We have evidence that could bring down the entire conspiracy." Tommy smiled grimly. "I can do better than that. I can help you survive long enough to make sure the evidence gets to multiple agencies simultaneously. Clearwater's corruption extends into federal law enforcement, but it doesn't extend everywhere." He led them into the gas station's building, which had been converted into a sophisticated communications center. Multiple computer screens showed news feeds, law enforcement radio frequencies, and what looked like real-time satellite imagery of the surrounding area. "Been tracking Clearwater's operations for months," Tommy explained as he pulled up files on his computers. "They've made a lot of enemies, and some of us have been preparing for the day when we'd have enough evidence to fight back." Sarah stared at the screens, realizing that they had stumbled into something much larger than they had imagined. Tommy wasn't just a lone farmer seeking revenge. He was part of an organized resistance movement that had been gathering intelligence on Clearwater for months. "How many people are involved in this?" she asked. Tommy's smile grew wider. "Enough to make sure that evidence reaches every major news organization, federal agency, and congressional committee that matters. Clearwater wanted a war. Now they're going to get one." Outside, the black vehicles continued their vigil, their occupants unaware that their quarry had just found powerful allies. The hunt was about to become a battle, and the outcome would determine whether justice would finally prevail or whether Clearwater's reign of terror would continue, unopposed. Tommy's communications center hummed with activity as he activated what he called the Montana Network, a group of farmers, ranchers, veterans, and local officials who had been quietly documenting Clearwater's crimes for months. Within minutes of his initial broadcast, responses began flooding in from across the state. "Bravo team reporting from Kalispell," crackled a voice over the radio. "We have Senator Blackwood's financial records ready for transmission. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, the whole package." Another voice chimed in from Missoula. Charlie team has visual confirmation on Clearwater's private security forces moving toward Riverside Junction. Estimated arrival time 20 minutes. Sarah watched in amazement as the wall of monitors displayed a real-time, tactical picture of Clearwater's operations throughout Montana. Red dots showed the positions of enemy forces, while green dots indicated network assets moving to counter them. "How long have you been building this?" she asked Tommy as he coordinated the responses. "Ever since my cattle started dying and the state veterinarian told me it was natural causes," Tommy replied, typing rapidly on multiple keyboards. "I knew something was rotten, but I needed proof. When I started digging, I found others who had lost family members, livestock, and property to Clearwater's operations." Rosa was studying one of the monitors that showed a detailed organizational chart of the network. Names and locations stretched across the entire state, with connecting lines that indicated relationships and communication pathways. Dr. Elizabeth Shun in Bozeman, Rosa read from one of the entries. "Says here she's been treating cancer patients whose symptoms match exposure to specific industrial chemicals." Dr. Chun was the first medical professional brave enough to document the health effects, Tommy explained. "Her research forms the medical foundation of our case against Clearwater." Marcus pointed to another name on the chart. "Judge Walter Harrison, but he's on Clearwater's payroll. We saw his name on the bribery list." Tommy's expression darkened. "That's Judge Walter Harrison Jr. His father is the one taking bribes. Jr. has been working undercover for months to gather evidence against his own father and the other corrupt officials." The complexity and scope of the network's operation was staggering. Sarah realized they had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of what amounted to a carefully planned insurrection against Clearwater's shadow government in Montana. "What's the endgame?" Sarah asked. "How does this all come together?" Before Tommy could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the communications center. On the main monitor, new red dots appeared along multiple approach routes to Riverside Junction. "Incoming," announced a voice over the radio. "Clearwater's bringing everything they've got. Helicopters, armored vehicles, and what looks like a full tactical team. They're not planning to take prisoners this time." Tommy began issuing rapid orders to his network teams while simultaneously uploading Sarah's evidence files to secure servers around the country. "All units, initiate Operation Daylight. Full evidence package goes live in 30 minutes unless I abort. Priority Alpha is protecting our witnesses and getting them to safety." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility as she realized the entire network was now mobilizing to protect her and the evidence she carried. Dozens of people were putting their lives at risk to ensure the truth about Clearwater's crimes reached the public. "I can't let all these people die for me," she said to Marcus and Rosa. "Maybe I should surrender and hope Clearwater will leave everyone else alone." "Mia," Rosa said firmly, gripping Sarah's shoulders, "your parents died for this truth. Tommy's cattle died for this truth. All those families whose belongings we found in that garage died for this truth. You don't get to give up now." Marcus was already gearing up with equipment Tommy had provided: body armor, communications gear, and weapons. Besides, Clearwater isn't interested in mercy. They've proven they'll kill anyone who threatens their operation, surrender or no surrender. Tommy finished his upload protocols and turned to address them directly. "Here's how this plays out. In 25 minutes, every major news organization in the country receives a complete evidence package documenting Clearwater's crimes. Senator Blackwood's offices are raided by federal agents who aren't on his payroll. And Clearwater's underground facility is exposed to congressional investigators." "What about us?" Sarah asked. "We need to survive long enough for the evidence to go public. Once it's out there, killing us becomes pointless. But until then, we're the most wanted fugitives in Montana." The sound of helicopters approaching made the decision for them. Tommy led them through a hidden tunnel that connected the gas station. to a concealed bunker built into the hillside behind the property. The bunker was equipped with enough supplies and communications equipment to sustain a small army. Built this after I came back from Afghanistan, Tommy explained as they settled into the underground facility. Figured if the government could turn on its own citizens overseas, it might happen here too. Turns out I was right. Through periscopes that allowed them to observe the surface, they watched as Clearwater's forces surrounded the gas station. Black helicopters circled overhead while armored vehicles took positions at every possible escape route. It was an overwhelming display of firepower that belonged in a war zone, not rural Montana. "How many men do they have?" Marcus asked, counting the visible forces. "Looks like about 50 in the immediate area," Tommy replied, monitoring multiple surveillance feeds. "But there are more moving in from other directions. They're treating this like a military operation." Sarah watched the deployment with growing dread. These weren't just corporate security guards or local law enforcement. These were professional soldiers equipped with military-grade weapons and vehicles. The scope of Clearwater's resources was far beyond anything she had imagined. "Tommy," a voice crackled over the radio. "Delta Team reporting. We've intercepted communications indicating Clearwater has federal backing for this operation. They're claiming you're domestic terrorists threatening critical infrastructure." Tommy cursed under his breath. That means they've got legal cover for using lethal force. Someone high up in the federal government is protecting Clearwater. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Clearwater had allies within the federal government powerful enough to authorize military action against American citizens, then the conspiracy reached far higher than Senator Blackwood. "Who could have that kind of authority?" she asked. "Someone in the Department of Homeland Security, maybe the Attorney General's office," Tommy replied grimly. "Or possibly even higher. We're not just fighting a mining company anymore. We're fighting elements within the federal government itself." As they watched, the mercenaries began a systematic search of the gas station and surrounding buildings. They moved with professional precision, clearing each structure methodically while maintaining communication with their command elements. 15 minutes until Operation Daylight goes live," Tommy announced, checking his watch. "Just need to hold out a little longer." But as he spoke, explosions began detonating around the gas station. Clearwater's forces were using breaching charges to access areas they couldn't search conventionally, including underground spaces. "They know about the tunnels," Marcus observed as dust rained down from the bunker's ceiling. "Someone gave them intelligence about your defensive preparations." Tommy's face went pale as he realized the implications. "There's a leak in the network. Someone's been feeding information to Clearwater. The systematic destruction of his carefully prepared defenses continued above them." Sarah could hear the mercenaries getting closer to the bunker's concealed entrance, their equipment detecting the underground facility despite its camouflage. "Options?" Marcus asked tersely. Tommy was already activating what looked like a self-destruct sequence for his communications equipment. "Emergency evacuation tunnel leads to the old mine shaft about half a mile north. From there, we can reach a network safe house in the next county." "What about Operation Daylight?" "It's automated now. The evidence goes public whether we're alive or dead." As they prepared to abandon the bunker, Sarah took one last look at the monitors showing Clearwater's forces surrounding their position. The display of military power was overwhelming, but it also confirmed something important. Clearwater was desperate enough to risk massive public exposure by conducting a paramilitary operation on American soil. "They're making a mistake," she said suddenly. "Look at all this firepower they're using. Even if they kill us, people are going to ask questions about why a mining company needed helicopters and armored vehicles to deal with 3 fugitives." Tommy paused in his evacuation preparations, considering her observation. "You're right. They're so focused on stopping the evidence from going public, that they're creating even more evidence of their criminal activities. Rosa was gathering the most important files from the bunker's archives. Maybe that's exactly what we want. Let them show the world what they're really capable of. The sound of breaching charges getting closer made the decision for them. They entered the emergency tunnel just as the first explosions reached the bunker's outer defenses. Behind them, Tommy's carefully built resistance headquarters was being systematically destroyed. But ahead of them lay something Clearwater hadn't anticipated, a network that had planned for exactly this kind of assault. Tommy's safe houses, communications, networks, and evidence distribution systems had been designed to survive even if the primary base was compromised. As they crawled through the evacuation tunnel, Sarah realized that Clearwater's overwhelming response had actually played into the network's hands. By treating 3 fugitives as a threat requiring military intervention, they had revealed the true extent of their power and their willingness to use it against American citizens. In just a few minutes, Operation Daylight would expose Clearwater's crimes to the world. But their response to being exposed would provide even more damning evidence of their criminal conspiracy. The hunt was about to become a public spectacle, and Sarah Williams was finally going to get the justice her parents had died seeking. The question was whether she would live to see it. Behind them, the sounds of destruction continued as Clearwater's forces obliterated Tommy's base. But ahead of them, the Montana Network's true strength was about to be revealed. The war for truth had begun, and the outcome would reshape the balance of power between corporate interests and the American people. Sarah clutched her parents' evidence files tighter as they emerged from the tunnel into the Montana wilderness. In her hands, she carried proof of crimes that reached the highest levels of government. But more importantly, she carried the hopes of every innocent person who had suffered at Clearwater's hands. The next few hours would determine whether those hopes would be fulfilled or crushed forever. The evacuation tunnel emerged in a dense thicket of pine trees beside an abandoned mining road. Sarah, Marcus, Rosa, and Tommy crawled out of the hidden entrance, just as the distant sound of explosions echoed across the valley behind them. Smoke rose from the direction of the gas station, marking the destruction of Tommy's resistance headquarters. 5 minutes until Operation Daylight goes live, Tommy announced, checking his watch while scanning the forest for signs of pursuit. Every major news organization in the country is about to receive the complete evidence package. Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and terror as the moment approached. Once the evidence went public, there would be no going back. Clearwater's crimes would be exposed to the world, but their response would likely be swift and deadly. Marcus pointed to a narrow deer trail that led deeper into the wilderness. Safe house is 2 miles through these woods. We need to move before Clearwater realizes we escaped. As they began jogging along the trail, Rosa suddenly stopped and pulled out a small radio receiver from her pack. "Wait," she said, adjusting the frequency. "I want to monitor the news broadcasts when the story breaks." Static filled the air as she searched for a clear signal, finally settling on a news station from Billings. The regular programming continued normally, but Sarah knew that was about to change dramatically. 3 minutes, Tommy said. They had reached a small clearing when the radio crackled to life with an urgent news bulletin. "This is KBIL News with a breaking story. We have just received extensive documentation alleging widespread corruption and environmental crimes involving the Clearwater Mining Company and numerous Montana state officials, including Senator Richard Blackwood." Sarah felt her heart race as she heard her father's investigation finally being broadcast to the public. After 8 months of silence and cover-ups, the truth was finally coming to light. The news anchor continued. The documents, provided by what appears to be a whistleblower organization, include financial records showing millions of dollars in bribes, environmental reports documenting systematic groundwater contamination, and what prosecutors are calling evidence of organized murder, campaigns targeting witnesses and investigators, Tommy smiled grimly as similar reports began broadcasting from other stations across the state. It's working. The story is spreading faster than Clearwater can contain it. But even as they celebrated this victory, the sound of helicopters grew. Louder overhead. Clearwater's forces were expanding their search pattern, and it was only a matter of time before they found the tunnel exit. "We need to keep moving," Marcus urged, but Rosa held up her hand for silence as the radio continued. In related developments, FBI agents are reportedly conducting simultaneous raids on Senator Blackwood's offices in Washington and Helena, as well as Clearwater mining facilities throughout Montana. Federal sources indicate this is part of a coordinated investigation involving multiple agencies. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Her parents' work was finally being vindicated. The conspiracy that had killed them was being exposed and prosecuted at the highest levels of government. But the victory celebration was cut short by the sound of vehicles approaching on the mining road. Through the trees, they could see a convoy of black SUVs and military trucks spreading out to search the area. "They found the tunnel exit," Tommy said. "We're about to have company." Instead of running, Marcus surprised everyone by pulling out his pistol and checking the ammunition. "I'm tired of running from these bastards. Maybe it's time to make a stand." "Marcus, no," Sarah protested. "You can't fight all of them. The evidence is already public. There's no point in dying now." But Tommy was thinking along different lines. Actually, Marcus might be right. Not about fighting them, but about the timing. If Clearwater's mercenaries kill us now, right after the evidence went public, it'll be the final nail in their coffin. Rosa understood immediately. The optics would be terrible for them. They'd be proving everything the evidence says about their willingness to commit murder. The sound of approaching troops grew closer as Clearwater's forces began systematically searching the forest. Sarah could hear orders being shouted and equipment being deployed as they closed in on the fugitives' position. "Tommy, this is Alpha Command," a voice suddenly crackled over Tommy's radio. "Network assets are in position around your location. We have eyes on Clearwater forces and are recording everything." Tommy grinned as he realized what was happening. The network is documenting this entire operation. If Clearwater kills us, it'll be caught on video and broadcast around the world. Sarah felt a chill as she understood the full implications. They had become martyrs in waiting, their potential deaths serving as the final proof of Clearwater's criminal nature. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "I didn't survive this long just to die as a propaganda tool." Marcus holstered his weapon and put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "You're right, we've come too far to give up now. Tommy, what other options do we have?" Before Tommy could answer, a new voice joined the radio chatter, one that made everyone freeze in. "Surprise! All units, this is Agent Patricia Hayes, FBI. You are surrounded by federal agents and are ordered to stand down immediately. Any hostile action against the witnesses will be met with lethal force." Through the trees, Sarah could see the black-clad mercenaries suddenly stopping their advance and looking around in confusion. Additional figures in FBI windbreakers were emerging from concealed positions throughout the forest. "Agent Hayes?" Sarah breathed. How did she know where to find us? Tommy was grinning widely now. "Because the network includes people inside federal law enforcement. Agent Hayes has been coordinating with us for weeks, waiting for the right moment to act." The standoff in the forest became a tense negotiation as Clearwater's mercenaries found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by federal agents. Over the radio, they could hear the various parties trying to establish legal authority for their operations. "This is Commander Blake, Clearwater Security Services," an authoritative voice announced. "We are operating under federal authority to apprehend domestic terrorists threatening critical infrastructure." Agent Hayes' response was swift and decisive. Commander Blake, your federal authorization has been revoked as of 10 minutes ago. The Department of Homeland Security has disavowed any connection to your operation. You are now trespassing on federal land while attempting to murder federal witnesses. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized the tide had finally turned. Clearwater's allies within the federal government had apparently abandoned them once the evidence went public. All Clearwater personnel, Agent Hayes continued, you have 5 minutes to withdraw from the area or face arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal law. Your choice. Through the trees, they could see the mercenaries beginning to withdraw toward their vehicles. The overwhelming force that had seemed so invincible just minutes earlier was now retreating in disarray. Tommy led them out of the clearing toward where Agent Hayes was coordinating the federal response. The FBI agent was a tall, serious woman in her 40s who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling complex investigations. Ms. Williams, Agent Hayes said as they approached, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your parents' work has been invaluable to our investigation. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift from hunted fugitive to protected witness. What happens now? Now we prosecute everyone involved in this conspiracy, Agent Hayes replied. Your evidence, combined with what the network has gathered, gives us enough to bring down the entire operation. As FBI agents secured the area and began processing the crime scene, Sarah found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 48 hours ago, she had been chained in a chapel, powerless and alone. Now she was surrounded by federal agents committed to bringing her parents, killers, to justice. That the radio continued to broadcast updates as the scandal spread across the country. Senator Blackwood had been arrested while trying to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. Clearwater's CEO was in federal custody, and dozens of local officials were being rounded up for questioning. Your parents would be proud, Rosa said, squeezing Sarah's hand as they watched the coordinated law enforcement response. Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of closure beginning to replace the anger and grief that had driven her for so long. The truth was finally coming to light, and the people responsible for destroying her family were facing justice. But even as she celebrated this victory, Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. Clearwater's conspiracy had roots that extended throughout Montana's power structure, and rebuilding trust in government would take years of hard work. The girl who had been chained in a chapel had become the catalyst for one of the largest corruption investigations in Montana's history. And now, with the support of the Montana Network and federal law enforcement, she was ready to see it through to the end. 6 months later, Sarah Williams stood on the steps of the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana, watching as the last of Clearwater's executives was led away in handcuffs. The trials had dominated national headlines for weeks, exposing a conspiracy that reached far beyond anyone's initial imagination. Senator Richard Blackwood had received a life sentence for racketeering, murder conspiracy, and environmental terrorism. Clearwater Mining Company had been dissolved, its assets seized to fund environmental cleanup and victim compensation. Dozens of local officials, from Sheriff Coleman to Judge Harrison Sr., were serving lengthy federal prison sentences. 47 murder convictions, Agent Hayes said, joining Sarah on the courthouse steps. That's more than most serial killers manage in a lifetime. Your parents' evidence made it all possible. Sarah looked out over the crowd of reporters and victims' families who had gathered for the final sentencing. Emma stood beside her, no longer the frightened 12-year-old who had lost her parents, but a confident teenager who had testified bravely at multiple trials. What happens to Cedar Falls now? Sarah asked. Complete environmental remediation funded by Clearwater's seized assets, Agent Hayes replied. New water treatment facilities, soil decontamination, medical monitoring. For everyone exposed to the toxins. It'll take years, but the community will recover. Father Morrison had been defrocked, and sentenced to 20 years for his role in the conspiracy. Mrs. Pemberton faced charges for child endangerment and conspiracy, but had received a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against higher-level conspirators. The Riverside Orphanage had been closed and replaced with a modern facility, run by the state. Marcus Thornfield approached from where he had been speaking with other ranchers whose land was being restored. His cattle were healthy again, grazing on pastures that had been cleaned of contamination using Clearwater's own money. "The Montana network is being officially recognized by the governor," he announced. "Tommy's being appointed to head a new Citizen Oversight Committee to prevent this kind of corruption from happening again." Tommy himself had become something of a folk hero, his story of building a resistance movement, inspiring similar efforts in other states where corporate power had overwhelmed local democracy. His testimony before Congress had led to new laws, protecting whistleblowers and requiring greater transparency in environmental monitoring. Rosa walked over carrying a bouquet of flowers, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "For your parents' graves," she said, handing the flowers to Sarah. "They finally got the justice they died seeking." The cemetery behind St. Mercy's Chapel had been restored and consecrated properly. Father O'Malley, the priest who had been transferred for refusing to cooperate with Clearwater, had returned to conduct the memorial services for all the conspiracy's victims. David and Maria Williams now rested beneath a headstone that proclaimed them champions of truth and justice. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself thinking about all the lives that had been touched by her family's tragedy. Dr. Elizabeth Chun's medical research had led to new treatments for environmental poisoning. Judge Walter Harrison Jr. had been appointed to replace his corrupt father, bringing integrity back to the local court system. Families throughout Montana were rebuilding their lives with compensation money and the knowledge that their suffering had not been in vain. "What's next for you?" Agent Hayes asked Sarah as they walked away from the courthouse. Sarah smiled, feeling truly hopeful for the first time since her parents' death. "College in the fall. Pre-law, then environmental science. I want to make sure this never happens again." Emma had announced her intention to study journalism, inspired by the reporters who had helped expose Clearwater's crimes. The Williams sisters were determined to use their education to protect others from the kind of corruption that had destroyed their family. As they reached the car that would take them back to their new home with a foster family in Billings, Sarah looked back at the courthouse one last time. The building where justice had finally been served stood as a monument to the power of ordinary people to stand against overwhelming corruption. The girl who had been chained in a chapel had become a symbol of resistance against corporate tyranny. Her parents' investigation had toppled a conspiracy that had seemed untouchable. And now, with Emma by her side and a network of allies throughout Montana, Sarah was ready to build a better future. The chains that had bound her in St. Mercy's Chapel had been replaced by the bonds of community and shared purpose. The tears she had shed in that dark sanctuary had watered the seeds of justice that now bloomed across Montana. Clearwater Mining Company was gone, its executives imprisoned, its crimes exposed to the world. The people they had poisoned and murdered would never be forgotten. And the children of Montana would grow up in a world where corporations could no longer buy the silence of government officials. Sarah Williams had kept her promise to her parents. She had finished what they started. And in doing so, she had proven that even in the darkest moments, even when facing the most powerful enemies, truth and justice could still prevail. The last chapter of Clearwater's reign of terror had been written. But the first chapter of Montana's renewal was just beginning, and Sarah Williams would be there to help write it. As their car pulled away from the courthouse, Sarah caught a glimpse of St. Mercy's Chapel on the hill overlooking Cedar Falls. The building where she had been chained now stood as a reminder that even the most sacred places could be corrupted by greed, but also that courage and determination could restore them to their proper purpose. The chapel bells were ringing. calling the community to prayer and reflection. But this time, the sound carried hope instead of despair, promising a future where children would never again be chained for seeking the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.